This is Reasonable Doubt with your hosts, Mark Garrigus and Adam Carolla.
Yeah, get it on. Got to get on a church, but got a mandate. Get it on, and welcome to Reasonable Doubt. That's what I'm doing. It is Mark Garrigus over there, Adam Carolla over here. Mark Garrigus is in Palm Springs.
Correct.
Nice.
Adam looks like you're ready for Palm Springs. You got the sunglasses on. You got the black backdrop. It was beautiful here yesterday.
I have those glasses that are polarized and they change out in the sun, and I hang them off the front of my shirt, so it'll take a little bit to get them back to clear. All right, so
supposedly that's a very. By the way, I highly recommend that. I've heard that saves sight, and sight is important. So I read something this morning that made me think of you, and it was some DOJ prosecutors. First, there was a 60 Minutes piece lambasting, or not lambasting. A judge was lambasting the prosecution for somebody giving a 60 Minutes interview talking about sedition in regards to January 6th. And then apparently the prosecutors have had to walk back some statements that were made in various bail hearings. I wish you could hold prosecutors accountable to statements made in bail hearings more often, because in order to keep somebody in custody, because it almost seems like that's in Prosecutor 101, keep them in custody and it increases the likelihood of a plea. There's been some rather fanciful statements made that have had to be walked back all over the place. The reason I thought of you is because when you question some of these things that have been said, it seems that you and some Article 3 federal judges are sharing the same space about questioning some of the more outlandish claims that are being made.
Well, my take on the whole incident is, it started as a riot. I mean, it was labeled a riot. Then it turned into sedition, and then it turned into a white supremacist riot and sedition, and then it turned into a armed, white supremacist, whatever. So I can kind of see which way they're going, and my take is if that's what it was, then that's how you have to move forward with your prosecutions. But you can't just kind of will it into something that it may not have been. It seemed like a rally that turned into a riot, that turned into a semi-violent riot. But, you're taking... you have the police officer that was killed with the fire extinguisher, except for he wasn't. You have the, 5 dead people, but the 5 dead people were all part of the riot and not part of the Capitol, not part of the Congress and not part of the Capitol Police. You have the 1 dead Capitol policeman, but like I said, that may have been because of bear spray, or we don't know, because they won't release an autopsy on him, and they won't say anything about the name of the officer that shot the woman in the face, and they won't give us any official particulars, which feels to me like they're trying to cook this. And I know it's kind of tears at the fabric of our society, but from the images and the pictures and Chewbacca man and stuff like that, it didn't smell to me like what you would traditionally think of as an armed white supremacist militia that had shown up to take over anything with any kind of strategic planning whatsoever. Now they'll go and say they were planning on this beforehand, but it also felt like a pretty small group of the hundreds of thousands of people that were there that actually broke into the Capitol. I mean, percentage-wise. And I actually heard a story the other day about an I think the guy was an ex-military guy who was also a police officer who showed up at the rally, but he never went to the Capitol. He just sort of stayed at the rally, and he was there to kind of chronicle it with a friend of his, and he's gotten fired. They took his badge, they took his gun, They're really spreading this thing out far and wide, and it feels highly politicized to me.
Well, it was interesting today. I was also reading. I saw a quote from Gerald Lefcourt. Gerald Lefcourt is a very highly regarded criminal defense lawyer. I think he may have even been a past president of National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And he was complaining, and this is somebody who I would imagine, I'm just going to take a wild guess here, would probably be on the political side of the aisle that I am, and would share an affinity for the left that I do. But he was talking about the politicalization of the politics and the criminalization of what has happened. And that's always been my fear about when it becomes, well, we got to get these people because, we're now in power. And I complained about that 20 years ago when it was aimed at Clinton. And I think I would complain about it now when it's aimed at, what it looks like here, Trump's supporters. I think that so far the prosecutors seem to have kind of dialed back the rhetoric. It's interesting to me. Part of the, there was one of the people who's being prosecuted, they talked about at the bail hearing that he was carrying an encrypted phone. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't an encrypted phone. His battery had just died. And so they admitted it and they conceded it. And I thought that was healthy, that they conceded it. Maybe I probably will get a call from his lawyer telling me that the only reason they conceded it is because they showed that they got their records and there were no calls made that day because the phone was left somewhere. There were also, and this has become kind of a new prosecutorial method, they search social media and they find Facebook posts. And so part of what was initially reported is they're in the tunnels, gas them, and lock them up in the tunnels and gas them. Apparently, the interpretation was that it looked damning that there were communications going on and that they were going to round up congressmen in the tunnels and gas them. Turned out that it was some wackadoo who was sending out Facebook messages that weren't either opened or seen or engaged with by the defendant. So that's always my worry. Having been in courtrooms, I can't even guesstimate how many arraignments and bail hearings I've done in my career. But sometimes you just hear stuff that is crazy, that is batshit crazy. And later, one of the articles I read mentioned this today. Sometimes that comes back to bite you from the judge, because the judge is sitting there, they made a bunch of statements and the judge has deprived somebody of their liberty interest based on those statements. Then it turns out, boom, 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 most, if not all, were overblown. That's a tough position to be in when you're standing in front of a judge.
Well, speaking of that, we talked about this in prior episodes, but they also indicated that they thought there were members of Congress who were in on the insurrection and that they were going to start looking into that and naming names, but they never seemed to. I don't know. You thought there was some meat on that bone. I haven't heard any follow-ups to that.
Yeah, and I just hope that a lot of my early tendencies weren't whipped up by misreporting. There's said it for years, there's a symbiotic relationship between the media and the prosecution in a lot of cases, not the least of which is because law enforcement is almost always, especially in the state and local systems, they've got this relationship with the reporters on the beat, and the reporters depend on them as sources.
Yeah, I just think, there's still a fence around the Capitol, I think, with barbed wire. They still have the National Guard there. I just feel like that's all part of the play that they're trying to direct. They're trying to cast this play. There was that big kerfuffle a few weeks ago that there was going to be a second attempt, and they got reliable sources. I just feel like they're taking a thing that was a mob that rioted essentially and trying to graft on a bunch of QAnon, white supremacist, armed militia. We've got to protect the Capitol. We have to put the fence up. I don't think I think putting the fence up was part of the theater of it. I think the National Guard there and still there and the fence still there is all part of this theater to kind of will it into this thing that it really never was and certainly isn't now. I don't, it's the news. Yes, the news is working on this white supremacy thing. They're working on, we're having to, go to our armed services and flush these people out from within the ranks. I don't think there's any credible evidence. If you watch CNN, you'll get a different story, but I don't think there's any credible evidence that there's a dangerous, large white supremacist group that is capable of taking over the Capitol or has plans to do that, or that there's, a certain percentage of the military who are involved with this, who are ready to sort of stage a coup. And I just feel like it's all been cooked. And I'm not seeing any evidence that it hasn't been cooked. And the reason I know it's been cooked is because everything that gets reported in the cooked direction. Again, just the officer killed. Where did the fire extinguisher come from? Where did that story come from? It's a better story for you, armed. We went back and forth with armed, and the definition of armed. Well, it could be a flagpole, could be a potted plant. Yes, technically, in the eyes of the law. But when you just say an armed insurrection, nobody thinks of anything other than firearms. If we were talking about an armed insurrection in Cuba, and that was the news story, we wouldn't be thinking about guys with flagpoles and football helmets and potted plants. We would think it was an armed, as in firearm, insurrection. So I just think they're cooking it, and I think the news is going along with it. And I think this is how it's been going for the last, ever since Trump got in office. I was talking to Gary about Kyle Rittenhouse, whatever that teenager was. And, he was a white supremacist guy who showed up in Kenosha to kill people. Then you look at the footage, and this kid's running for his life, getting beat by a guy with a skateboard. Every story is that, the guy who shot up the massage parlor, that was a hate crime. There's another white supremacist who hated Asians. It's all cooked in one direction, and it's all the news, and it's all part of the new thing, which is white supremacy. That's the new thing. This thing that didn't exist.
The thing that really gives me kind of tying together some of your comments, the shooter in the South, I guess, at the massage parlors, to my mind, clearly was mentally ill, as most of these people usually are. Just in the throes of mental illness. The Boulder guy also just whacked out mentally ill in the throes of mental illness. And I've got clients who are charged with the most serious crimes and are mentally ill, and we keep trying to force a kind of a criminal justice system, and also now when you have these polarized political viewpoints, a narrative onto it, when in actuality it's not just, but the explanation, if you're actually being honest, is that these are people with ideations and mental illness, and they in their mind they could have picked or choose anything that informs the mental illness. We used to, in the days of radio transistors, it would be a transistor was implanted in my, tooth that was affected by low flying aircraft. That now is, Now the technology is greater, so the technology that's implanted in their brains is different. The ideas that they may express, or the way that it gets manifested, is truly mental illness, as opposed to kind of ideological things gone wrong. Clearly they can use that. They can tell that narrative, but at the bottom, there's almost virtually 2-1. These are people who have long struggled with mental illness, and we haven't dealt with it.
Yes.
We as a society don't deal with it.
Well, that's the story. Mental illness, and it's the shooters, both of them clearly mentally, having deep mental issues, whether it be the Colorado shooter or the Atlanta shooter. And then that could be said for the homeless situation, certainly out here in California, where it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And we keep talking in terms of, we got to get them some low cost housing. This is a mental issue. This is a mental health issue, and it's also a substance issue. It's not a house issue.
You can't call them homeless. They're unhoused.
They're unhoused, and they're just about trying to get them out of the park.
They're also experiencing homelessness.
They're experiencing homeless. Yes. Okay. Yes, they're experiencing homelessness.
So many of the things we talk about, the Capitol insurrection, whatever you want to call it, there is based on firsthand experience, there is an explanation that there are people there with mental illness that are attracted to kinds of things where you appeal to the mental illness and to these conspiracies. Part of the thing with so-called crazy conspiracy theories, and you may have been referencing this, I don't know. One of the ones was there was really going to be another inauguration on March 20th, or that Trump was coming back or something like that. There were people who believed it, and now you're reading stories about people trying to cure their loved ones and things of that nature. I think a lot of this is we have a very weird relationship in the U.S. with mental illness. We do not, it's almost like we've stigmatized it to the point where we don't want to call it for what it is. Dr. Alien, Thursday Guy, these guys who are all over, as you mentioned, in L.A., they have mental illness. They medicate with meth, usually seems to be the drug of choice in downtown L.A., and what happens when you're on meth? It gets pretty wild.
You get paranoid, delusional. Yeah. Well, I think they're trying to clean out MacArthur Park because it's literally just been taken over by people living in tents, pitching in tents. And the city said, we're going to clear you out of the park, but we will provide a hotel room for you. And I think half the people in the park living on the ground said, no, we don't want it. So if it's just about homelessness, then we've offered you a home. But if you're declining the home, essentially the roof and the running water, well, then maybe it's not about that. Maybe it's a mental issue. All right, let's talk about the Chauvin trial and what's going on in Minneapolis.
Gary, do you have they finally got a jury. I do not know that I printed out the exact. Gary, do you have the makeup of it? It's pretty diverse. Yeah, if you give the makeup, I'll run it down now.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting the way that they describe them all. It's they sort of just have like a one-line description for each one of them, and we've gone over some of them before. But let's see here. Give me just a second. My computer's
there's, I believe, 14 total, 12 regular jurors who are serving, 2 alternate jurors who would only serve if something happens to one of the regular impaneled jurors, which is interesting because most judges take the position that I want one alternate for every week of trial. That tends to be a rule of thumb. This Judge Cahill did not do that in this case.
Yeah, and what the judge was sort of saying, at least what I inferred from what he said, is that this might be a COVID thing. He's saying that the room is physically not big enough to have the number of jurors that they may normally have. So what he did was he seated 12 jurors and he seated 3 alternates, and then the plan was apparently if all 14 if the 12 jurors and 2 alternates showed up, then he was planning to dismiss the third one for space issues. And the breakdown goes like this. A white man in his 20s who works as an accountant, has a 6-month-old Bernese mountain dog, and plans to move out of the state at the end of May. A white woman in her 20s who works as a social worker and was recently married. A white woman in her 50s who described herself as an animal lover with a passion for affordable housing. I don't know what that means.
That means she does jack squat.
Anyways, a white woman in her 40s who works as in insurance and said she loves the state of Minnesota. A black woman in her 60s who retired from marketing and said she loves spending time with her grandkids and volunteering in youth organizations. A white nurse in her 50s who works with ventilated COVID-19 patients. A mixed-race woman in her 40s who works in company reorganization. A black man in his 40s who works in management and has lived in Hennepin County for 2 decades. A white woman in her 50s who works in healthcare and likes to ride her motorcycle. A black man in his 30s who works in banking and coaches youth sports. A white woman in her 50s who works at a nonprofit and is the single mother of 2 teenage sons. A black man in his 30s who works in tech and immigrated from Africa to the United States. A white business auditor in his 30s. A mixed-race woman in her 20s who said she registered to vote in hope of getting a jury summons for the Chauvin case. And a white chemist in his 20s who works in environmental testing and plays ultimate frisbee.
Oh, yeah. That's going to be a tough one for the defense.
Mark, I was wondering about the one who's openly said they registered to vote hoping to get on this jury. That seems like...
Early on in this thing, I was perplexed by the prosecution. Now that we've got a jury, they look like geniuses because there's 5 people on there that I would have driven into a cement barrier rather than have them on that jury. I mean, somebody who registered to vote to be on the jury is the ultimate juror who's got an agenda. Nobody wants to be on a jury. Well, and I know I got some pushback on that last time I said it, but I don't think anybody wants to be on a jury in a highly charged atmosphere where there's already been repercussions, so to speak. It makes very little sense to me.
Well, let's talk about black versus white for a second. So I could see that the white people, especially a young white person, might not want to go against some of the black jurists when it comes time to deliberate. I could see I could feel that they wouldn't like the optics of that. You know, I think everything is so racially charged now. It would take a lot, especially for a young white woman, to sit in a room that was half black and explain to them, I think this officer should go free. That seems difficult. On the other hand, it would be more difficult, I would assume, as a black juror to let the officer go free because you may be punished more outside of the courthouse than the white, because at that point you become a sort of turncoat or an Uncle Tom, and the pressure, I think, as a black juror would be much more difficult once you got outside. You know, once the trial ended, if you put in an innocent verdict in, that would be a very difficult place to be. A black man who voted innocent in the Chauvin trial once you re-entered your community. Thoughts, Mark? Well,
that's one of the reasons that I really think the judge should have, and I don't understand why he didn't. They should be sequestered the minute the trial starts. They should be put up in a hotel and sequestered, and they should not be going home each evening. They shouldn't be, and I don't believe that he's done this. I think he's only going to sequester them during deliberations. And I think that's a horrible, terrible mistake. Everybody is analyzing this in terms of race, and I assume that that's the elephant in the room, obviously, just given how this has been played out. But the admission of the, was it 2019 body cam video that we talked about last week, that is a game changer for the defense. And I'll tell you how. There's going to be, there's one portrait that the prosecution is going to paint of George Floyd. That portrait now has changed dramatically from the defense standpoint once that body cam video comes in. And it's interesting to me. I would want to know how people react to the idea of what the defense is going to put forward. And I think that is dependent not just on race, but I think it's also occupation. I hear youth coach. I hear somebody who's an auditor, or kind of, auditors play by the rules. Those are the way they view things. They see somebody.
I think you're talking about the accountant. Was it the
This
accountant?
is somebody who's an accountant or an auditor.
I think one guy, one of the early guys, was a white male in his 20s, and he was an accountant, I think.
Yeah, I think there's two that are accountants. One is described as a business auditor in his 30s, and then the other one is a white man in his 20s who works as an accountant, has a 6-month-old Bernese Mountain Dog, and plans to move out of the state at the end of May.
What's the dog's name, Gary? The fuck cares what kind of dog you have?
What race is the business auditor?
They're
Bernese.
white. Sorry,
No,
they're both white.
They're both white guys. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to be.
Yeah, there's a race is always tough in a lot of different ways. I've defended hundreds, if not thousands, of African Americans, and sometimes the hardest jurors on them are fellow African Americans, depending on what the charge is and things like that. Now, here you're defending a white cop, and how does that translate? Well, to some degree, letting in that previous body cam video is going to change, I think, dramatically the prosecution's narrative and how jurors react, because that is not, George Floyd is going to be painted by the defense in a completely different light. And I don't know how people who have no arrest record and are themselves coaching high school sports or young people's sports, how they're going to view somebody who the defense is going to portray as ingests all his drugs whenever he has a police encounter.
Well, I'll tell you who you want if you're the defense. I'll tell you, there was one name, I think it was a black gentleman, but he was not born here. He came from, I don't know.
Works in tech and immigrated from Africa to the U.S.
Right. That, to me, the immigrants, oftentimes, it's sort of like big difference between Hispanics and folks who came here from Cuba. They may be Hispanic as well, but they have a totally different relationship with Democrats and Republicans and voting, and they're different. So I find that the most conservative people who you might find may have been the immigrants from Africa, the recent, and I would imagine a guy like that. See, anyone you have who comes here from a different place, who is seeking an opportunity, if he sees people squandering their opportunity, essentially, these guys all came here, fled, God knows what kind of oppression, came here and started a life. They're much less sympathetic, I think, to people that were born here. At least immigrants I've spoken to, they sort of are slightly appalled at the Americans who they feel like were born with all the advantages and just sort of squandered them.
Yeah, had that same anecdotal experience when Trump was ramping up the border wars, and the number of Armenian, what I can't call them fobs, Armenian immigrants who were adamantly pro-Trump when it came to immigration. And I would often pose the question, if Trump thought, for instance, that he'd garner votes by revoking your naturalized citizenship, and they can't even comprehend that. I'm here, I know what I got. These other people are, it's kind of not in my backyard, which we used to say about real estate development in California. There is a NIMBY, not in my backyard element to it. I'm here. I don't want anybody else coming in on immigration. And I've had the same experience. They have a very dim view, immigrants do, of Americans who were born here and squandered the opportunity. Part of it is they're required to take civics lessons in order to become naturalized citizens. And so it's more fresh in their mind, maybe. I don't know if that's an explanation for it.
Yeah, but I think a guy, it's kind of interesting. If I was looking to, during jury selection and looking for African-American jurors, I would be looking for actual African-American jurors, like actual jurors who came here from, Nigeria, in the last 5 years. All right, let me hit Geico. Do you rent your home? Well, you do one or the other, and you have your automotive policy. Well, good news. There's Geico. Geico makes it easy to bundle your homeowners or renters insurance along with your automotive policy, and it's easy. You just go to geico.com, you get a quote, you see just how much you could save when you go to geico.com. So go to geico.com, get your bundle on, and see just how much you could be saving. All right, so the trial is going to start on Monday, right?
Right, and I'm going to surmise, given the selection here, that the defense has come to the conclusion that they're never going to get a not guilty across the board. So they're trying to engineer a situation where they get acquittals on the murder and then a hung jury on the manslaughter. I think that's where they're kind of gearing it for. Otherwise, some of these choices are inexplicable. And I'm not second guessing him. He's there, Eric's there, and he's selecting the jury. And I've been there hundreds of times too, where I just, there's no way that I think I can get an acquittal. So I've got to engineer some kind of a hung jury. And one of the ways that you do that is it's not as much the 12 in the box that you got to have 12 winners. You just got to get somebody on there who's going to be receptive to your arguments and who's going to hang it for you on the basis of reasonable doubt and saying, no, I'm not going to change my mind at 3:55 before we have to go home at 4:00 on a Friday. And if he feels like he being the defense lawyer, like he's got one or two of those that aren't going to go anywhere, then he probably will put up with 5 or 6 that he doesn't care about because he's never going to win them over anyway. And it sounds like that's exactly what the calculation is.
Well, we talked a lot about Floyd's past and background and criminal behavior, but we didn't really get to Chauvin. I've heard little snippets about him getting into trouble before as an officer, but I don't know. I've not fully seen that picture. When it came out, when the first thing happened, they talked about previous complaints against him during his career, but I haven't heard anything recently about it. Have you?
No, and it's interesting. I wonder why, because I'm wondering if there isn't a calculation that they don't want to give the judge, because judges tend to try to be fair to both sides, but sometimes one of the the natural human reactions to that is if the prosecution wants to delve too much into Chauvin's history, then that he may feel more compelled to let the defense probe into more of Floyd's history. And so I think he's probably trying to avoid that, or they're trying to avoid this tit for tat notion.
Yeah, that's a very astute observation because, yes.
I can tell you guys that Chauvin has 18 complaints on his official record, 2 of which ended in discipline, including official letters of reprimand, and he's been involved in 3 police shootings, one of which was fatal.
Yeah, so if they start going down that road, then the judge is going to say, now I've opened the door to you going down the road. I mean, if we're going to look at history, then we'll look at all the history on both sides.
Right. And there's a tendency, and there's evidentiary case law that in some cases, and this is quite a generalization, that you can do that. And, sometimes they talk about opening the door. Sometimes they talk about other things. The interesting, I can hardly wait for the opening statements. I just think the opening statements are going to give us a window into how this case is going to be approached in front of this jury. And you're going to tailor, if you're the defense, you're going to tailor your opening statement to whichever jurors you think you can still salvage and that will give voice to your defense. So it's going to be, depending on what happens, we may have to do a 15-minute update after opening statements.
Hey, Gary, one of the
Yes, sir.
arguments I think the defense is going to make is the size and physicality of Floyd. He just seemed like a large, well-built guy. I don't know if Chauvin's, a waif model, but I think part of the argument is going to be our guy was giving away 60 pounds of muscle to this guy, and he was out of his mind, so we didn't want to let him up. We didn't know what he could do, or some version of that, because every time I see George Floyd, I just think, God, this guy looked like he played college football.
6'4", 225.
6'4", 225, and like lean.
Yeah,
like he
looks muscular. For
well-built dude. Now I'm curious what Chauvin was, because if he was, 5'9", 165, he's going to make this argument. I do believe. I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
5'9", 155.
5'9".
Wow, look at you. There used to be that joke about the guys at the circus who guess your height and weight.
Yeah.
You missed your calling.
I think they're going to paint one guy's big and physical and the other guy as scared because of the size differentiation. So I don't know. Do you think that'll be an angle they work?
I just think, and I can be proven wrong here as quickly as Monday, but or Tuesday. I think that with the earlier video now the argument is going to be, yeah, it was hard to look at, but police work is hard to look at. And yeah, it sparked the movement, but we're not here to criminalize or acquit a movement. The coroner himself said if George Floyd was found at home, he would have ruled it an accidental overdose. He didn't, because there was so much brouhaha around this. Therefore, there was a pattern, and the pattern was whenever the cops came, he ingested whatever was on him, so that he knew enough to be under the influence as opposed to possession. So we know what the difference there is, because he's savvy. And unfortunately, given having COVID and given his heart disease or coronary disease and issues and high blood pressure, and then that happened, it would have, to quote the coroner, if he had been found at home, it would have been an accidental overdose, and there is no criminal liability here. I think that's the opening statement by the defense. I think that's where they're going to go.
Yeah, how does COVID? I know he was COVID positive. I think they'd found. I wonder how that factors in. I mean, from a medical standpoint, if because they do say that COVID attacks the lungs, and most people who get it have lung issues and breathing issues. So having the COVID, and I guess the fentanyl does that, creates that as well. But it may have had nothing to do with it, but what I'm saying is as long as everyone has COVID on the brain and COVID, does attack the lungs, maybe that's part of the argument. What you're trying to get away from is the knee on the neck. So you're
correct,
trying,
and that's why that's going to come in. I think you're going to see quite a bit of skirmishes on the pathologist, and I would imagine they're going to have a private pathologist testify, and you're going to hear about police practices person, and you're going to say, well, is this an appropriate police practice? And they're going to say, these police practices experts, whenever the cops are charged, they'll say anything. I mean, the guy, there's no floor to what's appropriate. So I think that you're going to hear all about that.
In a case like this, with the fairly damning evidence of the coroner saying that he had enough fentanyl in him to he would have called it an accidental overdose. Does the prosecution then rebut that with their own expert?
Yes, I think they're going to have to somehow walk that back. They're going to have to somehow just say he wasn't found at home. I mean, as good prosecutors will just make the argument he wasn't found at home. That's pure rank speculation. We could see what was happening. Even the other officers who were there, who weren't veterans, could see what was happening, and the crowd could see what was happening. And don't leave your common sense at the door. This is an obvious murder because blah blah blah. I also am on want to see whether or not anybody touches whether these two, Floyd and Chauvin, knew each other, and if that's going to play into part of this, whether it's the prosecution or the defense.
But does the prosecution get their own pathologist in there as an expert?
Look, the symbiotic relationship between the prosecution and the coroners are unbelievable. The coroners are basically guided by the lead detective towards where they want to go. And so when you say, do they get their own, they've got their own in-house. The coroner's office doesn't generally testify against a prosecution theory. In fact, they usually wrap themselves up in the prosecution theory. That's the cynical criminal defense lawyer view.
But they already made the statement about 3 times the sort of lethal dose of fentanyl. So are they going to then walk that back?
I don't know if it was necessarily a statement. I think it was in a report that was leaked to the media. So whether or not that's admissible in the case is probably the question.
Yeah, I think Gary's right. I think it was he had notes, and I don't know if the notes were somewhere else. Sometimes they dictate while they're doing it. Mm-hmm. Other times they'll take contemporaneous notes, but it's been reported that it was in notes. I think it will come in. I can't imagine how that would not come in cross-examination. And if you're a smart prosecutor, you're going to try somehow to preempt that, because you don't want to let jurors, and a couple of those jurors may actually have a presumption of innocence. If that's the case, you don't want to let them feel like you hoodwink them by getting all the information only on cross-examination. You want to preempt that. You want to deal with it up front.
Well, okay, a good stopping point for us. We can certainly revisit a lot of this in our next episode, because Mark and I will have heard the opening statements, and Mark will have thoughts, and I will have thoughts even if I haven't heard them, based on Mark's thoughts. I'm going to be in Nashville, Tennessee, coming up at Zany's. That'll be April 14th, doing live pod there. You can go to AdamCarolla.com, because I got shows coming up all over the place, and you can check out our Chassis channel on Pluto TV, channel 585. Lots of good stuff there, including Adam Carolla Goes Racing and a lot of content. So what do you got, Mark?
I'm sitting here at Palm Springs. I'll tell you, Gigi's is open for brunch on the weekend. Stop by. Elixir, the pool scene, is something to behold. And stop by if you're in New York, Prova, both in Times Square and in GTC. And also downtown LA, come say hi to Dr. Alien and Thursday Guy at Engine Company and Mediterranean Tapas at Tenin.
So, until next time, Adam Carolla for Mark Garriga saying, Mahala.
Thanks for listening to Reasonable Doubt. Tune in next Saturday for an all-new episode.